The Declaration of Independence is often remembered as a bold announcement of freedom, but it was also a dangerous gamble that could have cost its authors their lives. Behind its famous words lies a story of secrecy, fear, political compromise, and ideas borrowed from centuries of conflict and philosophy. And even after it was signed, most Americans never heard it read aloud, while the man who wrote it would later admit the document did not say everything he wanted it to say. The Declaration of Independence is one of the most recognized documents in world history. Its opening lines speak of equality, natural rights, and the consent of the governed. But the document was not born in confidence or unity. It emerged from deep division, uncertainty, and a revolutionary moment when the future of 13 colonies hung in the balance. In early 1776, independence was still a radical idea. Many colonists remained loyal to Britain. Others feared that breaking away would lead to economic collapse, foreign invasion, or civil war. Even within the Continental Congress, there was no clear consensus. Independence was discussed in whispers, not speeches. For months, Congress operated under strict secrecy. Windows were closed. Guards were posted. Delegates were warned that their conversations could not leave the room. If British authorities discovered an organized push for independence, it could mean immediate arrests for treason. The push toward independence accelerated not because everyone wanted it, but because reconciliation had failed. Colonists had petitioned King George III repeatedly, asking for relief from taxes, military occupation, and political control. Each appeal was ignored or rejected. In August 1775, the king formally declared the colonies in rebellion. That declaration changed everything. It told colonial leaders that compromise was no longer possible. If they were already considered rebels, then declaring independence became a matter of survival rather than ideology. In June 1776, Congress finally appointed a small committee to draft a formal declaration. It included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Jefferson was chosen as the primary author not because he was the most experienced, but because he was known as a powerful writer, and because others wanted distance from the document if it failed. Jefferson wrote most of the draft in isolation, working from borrowed ideas rather than original ones. He drew heavily from Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, who argued that governments exist to protect natural rights and can be overthrown when they fail to do so. Jefferson also echoed earlier colonial documents and even parts of his own writings. One of the document's lesser-known secrets is how much of it was removed. Jefferson originally included a long passage condemning the British Crown for supporting slavery and the slave trade. Southern delegates objected strongly, fearing it would divide the colonies and threaten their economies. The passage was cut. This removal revealed a core contradiction at the heart of the Declaration. It proclaimed that all men are created equal, yet allowed slavery to continue. The document did not resolve this contradiction, it postponed it, pushing the problem into the future. The editing process was brutal. Congress revised Jefferson's draft heavily, cutting and altering language to make it more acceptable to a divided audience. Nearly 1/4 of the original text was removed or changed. Jefferson later admitted he was frustrated but understood the political necessity. Another secret of the Declaration is that it was not signed on July 4th. That date marks its adoption, not its completion. Most delegates signed the document weeks later, on August 2, 1776. Some never signed at all. Others signed knowing full well that if Britain won the war, their names would become a death warrant. By signing, they committed treason against the British Crown. The punishment for treason was execution. This was not symbolic defiance, it was a personal risk unlike anything most politicians face today. Even after its adoption, the Declaration was not immediately celebrated. In some areas, it was read aloud in town squares and met with cheers. In others, it was ignored or met with silence. For many colonists, daily survival mattered more than political philosophy. Internationally, the Declaration served another purpose. It was written as much for foreign governments as for Americans. By declaring independence, the colonies could now seek alliances as a sovereign nation. This was critical in gaining support from France, which would later prove decisive in winning the war. The list of grievances against King George III was carefully constructed. It was not just a complaint, it was a legal argument. Each accusation was designed to justify rebellion under existing political theory. Independence needed to appear lawful, not reckless. Another little-known truth is that the Declaration did not create a new government. It announced separation, but it offered no plan for unity or governance. That would come later, through the Articles of Confederation and eventually the Constitution. The document's language was intentionally universal, even though its immediate application was limited. Jefferson and others hoped its principles would outlive the moment. They believed that by grounding independence in natural rights, they were creating a moral standard future generations could build upon or challenge. The British response was swift and dismissive. King George III never addressed the Declaration directly. Instead, he reinforced military efforts to crush the rebellion. For the next 5 years, independence existed mostly on paper, while the war decided whether it would become reality. Ironically, the Declaration had little legal power during the war itself. Its importance grew after independence was secured. Over time, it became a symbol of American identity and a source of moral authority. The words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were especially significant. Jefferson replaced the more traditional phrase life, liberty, and property, signaling a broader vision of human fulfillment. Yet the meaning of that phrase would be debated for centuries. Another secret lies in who the Declaration did not mention. Women were excluded entirely. Native American nations were described as obstacles rather than partners. Enslaved people were invisible in its promises. The Declaration reflected the limits of its time as much as its aspirations. Despite these flaws, the document achieved something unprecedented. It framed revolution not as chaos, but as a justified response to tyranny. It turned rebellion into principle. After independence, the Declaration faded from daily political life. It was the Constitution that governed the nation. But in moments of crisis, Americans returned to the Declaration's language to measure how far the country had strayed from its founding ideals. Abraham Lincoln later called it a moral compass for the nation. Civil rights leaders invoked it to expose the gap between promise and reality. Its power came not from perfection, but from its clarity of vision. The greatest secret of the Declaration of Independence is that it was never meant to be finished. It was a beginning, not a conclusion. Its authors knew they were setting a standard they themselves could not fully meet. In the end, the Declaration was not just a break from Britain. It was a challenge to future generations to live up to words written in fear, compromise, and hope. That is why the Declaration of Independence still matters. Not because it solved America's problems, but because it dared to define what freedom could mean. And that is the story behind its secrets. Its influence did not stop at America's borders. Long after the ink dried, the Declaration of Independence began a second life far beyond the 13 colonies. Across Europe and Latin America, revolutionaries read its words as a blueprint for resistance. The idea that legitimacy came from the consent of the governed challenged monarchies that had ruled for centuries. Leaders of later independence movements, from France to Haiti to South America, would echo its language even when their own revolutions took very different paths. Inside the United States, however, the Declaration's legacy was complicated. For decades, it was treated more as a historical artifact than a living guide. The early republic focused on survival, expansion, and governance. The Constitution became the practical foundation of law, while the Declaration remained a symbol, important, but distant. That changed during moments of national crisis. As tensions over slavery deepened in the 19th century, Americans began to reread the Declaration with new urgency. Its claim that all men are created equal stood in direct conflict with the reality of millions held in bondage. Abolitionists seized on the document as evidence that slavery betrayed the nation's founding principles. Southern defenders of slavery, in contrast, argued that the Declaration was merely a justification for separation from Britain, not a statement of universal equality. The same document was used to argue opposite sides of the same moral battle. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln elevated the Declaration to a new level of importance. He argued that the Constitution was written to preserve the principles of the Declaration, not the other way around. In Lincoln's view, the Declaration defined the purpose of the nation, while the Constitution provided the mechanism to pursue it. This interpretation transformed the document from a revolutionary announcement into a moral standard. It was no longer just about independence, it was about whether the nation was living up to its own ideals. Over time, other groups followed the same path. Women's rights advocates pointed to the Declaration's language to argue for equality. Civil rights leaders used its promises to expose injustice. Each generation found in the document both inspiration and accusation. Yet the Declaration remains misunderstood. It does not grant rights. It does not create law. Its power lies entirely in persuasion, in its ability to shape how people think about legitimacy, authority, and freedom. Perhaps the most overlooked truth is that the Declaration was written for the future as much as the present. Jefferson later said he did not aim for originality, but for expressions that would resonate with common understanding. He wanted words that ordinary people could claim as their own. That may be why the Declaration endures. It does not belong solely to its authors. It belongs to anyone willing to measure reality against principle. The secrecy, compromise, and fear behind its creation do not weaken its meaning. They strengthen it. The document was written by people who knew they were imperfect, acting in an uncertain world, making choices that carried enormous risk. They did not know whether independence would succeed. They did not know whether their words would matter. What they knew was that remaining silent was no longer an option. The Declaration of Independence was not a moment of certainty. It was an act of resolve. And its true secret is this: its power has never come from what it achieved in 1776, but from what it continues to demand of those who read it. In the end, the Declaration of Independence remains one of the most daring documents ever written, not because it guaranteed freedom, but because it dared to define it. It was born in secrecy, shaped by compromise, and signed in fear. Its authors were not prophets or saints. They were men facing impossible choices, aware that their words could cost them everything. And yet, they wrote anyway. The Declaration did not end injustice. It did not create equality. It did not unite all Americans. What it did was set a standard so clear that future generations could never ignore it. Every time the nation has fallen short of its ideals, the Declaration has stood as evidence, not of success, but of obligation. It reminds Americans that independence was never meant to be comfortable, and freedom was never meant to be passive. Its true legacy lies in its challenge. A challenge to question authority. A challenge to defend rights. A challenge to close the gap between promise and reality. More than 2 centuries later, the Declaration of Independence still asks the same question it asked in 1776: can a people govern themselves with justice, restraint, and courage? That question has never been fully answered. And that is why the Declaration endures, not as a relic of the past, but as a test of the future. Those are the real secrets behind the Declaration of Independence.